Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with New Role, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of New Role, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Navid Nazemian, CEO of Navid Nazemian Executive Coaching. Navid is an award-winning executive coach and author, most recently of the international bestseller, Mastering Executive Transitions, The Definitive Guide. As an executive coach, Navid has worked with leading global organizations, including ABB, BP, CCLA, Coca-Cola, KPMG, Pearson, Sonova, and Vodafone. Prior to his career as an executive coach, Navid gained over 20 years of international HR experience at Vodafone, Roche, and BAT. Widely regarded as one of the leading voices in the field of executive transition, Navid has been recognized as HR's most influential practitioner by HR Magazine, Coach of the Year by CEO Today, and he has received the Outstanding Leadership Awards from Education 2.0 in 2022. Navid, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ollie. It's a real honor. And I know this is a podcast, but I'm actually blushing after this very warm introduction. So really feel honored to be here.
It's great to have you. And I want to dive straight in. One of the key responsibilities any board has is hiring and firing the CEO. And across your work, you've highlighted various research reports that evidence a 40% failure rate at the executive level during the first 18 months when transitioning. So that's 4 out of 10 do not work out. And you've also drawn attention to the cost of getting it wrong and executive attrition, which your research suggests is 10 to 30 times the annual salary versus an average role where it might be 1.5 to 2 times the salary. So in that context, you've written about the top 10 reasons for executive transition failure. Which of those reasons do you see as most relevant to board members thinking about CEO succession?
Sure. So first off, allow me to say that when I started doing the research for my book and I came across this 40% failure rate, I wasn't quite sure if it's right. And so I had to do some digging to really get to the bottom of, is it really, really true? It's 4 out of 10 who don't make it. And I found 4 independent studies that all come to a very similar conclusion, if not the same. And the most validated one was a data from Heidrick & Struggles. I'm sure you know them and the audience will know them, one of the largest search firms in the world. And they had done over 20,000 executive placements over a 10-year time period. And if you were to circle back on those appointments, within an 18-month time period, 40% of those execs were either pushed out, failed, or quit. And so I think you can't have better data to make the point that the 40% failure rate is very much true and very, very much valid. So that's the first thing I want to say. Now, I have dedicated an entire chapter to the top 10 reasons for executive transition failure. And I will certainly not bore the audience with all the 10 reasons. But I've done something else for other podcasts and other webinars and presentations, which is what are the aggregated top 3 reasons for failure? So if we take the top 10 reasons and try to look at them through a theme, what are the themes that really get in the way of executives succeeding? And the 3 themes are people, culture, and politics. So it's rare that the organization hires a chief people officer and he or she isn't really knowledgeable around the people agenda and how to translate the strategy through the people side of the business. It's exceptionally rare to hire a chief finance officer and he or she isn't really good with the numbers and making sure that the value is created and challenges provided to the sales function and maybe the CEO. So it's not necessarily the technical reasons that seem to be getting in the way, but it's what HR has referred to for decades now as the so-called soft skills, which as we know are hard to learn and demonstrate, that seem to be getting really in the way.
Really interesting. Can you maybe just unpick those for me a little bit? Because at one level, I hear people, culture, and politics, and I can see a lot of overlap there. How do you break those out? If you're sitting there listening to this now as a board member thinking, okay, we've got this new CEO coming in, what are we going to do on each of those fronts? How do you think about that?
Yes. So first off, in my book, I have 6 prominent examples of CEOs who have failed with their own transition. And mind you, these are some of the most admired companies on the planet. And to give it away, this publicized data, so I'm not revealing anything I'm not supposed to here. SAP, right? Arguably the only real meaningful tech player outside of Silicon Valley. Hewlett Packard's a champion in their own rights, whether it's the printing business, whether it's the server business, they have been really dominating a few of those places for decades. Boeing, again, this is like a mystery to me. Only imagine if there were only two players in an industry. I mean, it doesn't matter where you're flying to these days, which airline you're picking. There's only at the Airbus and the Boeing chance that one of those two producers you will be sitting on their planes. And so again, that was a prominent example. And the fourth one I mentioned, just for sake of completion here, is Uber. Again, arguably the most successful ride-hailing, business globally. And yet all four of them have had failed transitions at the very top. This is the group CEO failing somewhere between 6 to 15 months. And so coming back to your initial question as to, do we have maybe a prominent example I can share to make the point more clear? I would like to take the example of Leo Apotheker. Now, again, for sake of transparency, I have never met this gentleman. I have never spoken to him, but I have done certainly a lot of reading into his short tenure at HP and what led the board of directors to ask him out only after 10 months of being hired. And so apparently what got in the way is the culture piece. And so he was brought in with a real mandate by the board to turn the company culture around. So whilst HP had been a champion in certain product categories and services, the board really wanted to move the company more towards a Google, an Apple, an Amazon, sort of kind of more into this really aggressive, really on the money type tech players. And so Leo Apotheker probably assumed, well, the board wants a force majeure type culture change, so let me bring that about. So when he was on his so-called listening tour, a lot of what happened was he sharing examples of how the company culture needed a change, and then a significant change, an overhaul. And I think this is one of the big mistakes I have seen executives making, which is, in my book, I speak about earning the rights to bring about culture change. Now, if you have been hired a month ago or a week ago, and you only have to say poor things about the existing company culture and everything else in your previous company was great, well, that may not necessarily generate an awful lot of buy-in. And people will really have a hard time to believe in what you say, because they will look at your time of appointment and look at what you're saying and probably thinking you have some sort of an agenda that you're trying to force over people's agendas. And so again, it's a very prominent example how somebody may fall into the trap of, although technically mandated by the board, but the way and the how of bringing about culture change is also a big issue. And now, if I wanted to flip that around, and let's say if he was brought in with that mandate and he sat on his chair for 2 years and did nothing, that's also a problem, right? Because if you wait for too long and suddenly want to change the culture overnight, people are going to look at you and say, you seem pretty happy with everything that has been going on here for 2 years plus. What is the burning platform? Suddenly, where has this new data emerged that is asking you to ask us to change overnight? And so again, that is also problematic. But so timing is of the essence, as is the how of culture change. Now, in terms of how he might have gotten this right, and there are many examples of how other CEOs have gotten this right, is typically the idea of a listening tour, as the word is suggesting, is to listen, right? And so you go out, you meet your different lines of business, you meet your production sites, you meet your customers, key accounts, you meet your suppliers, you meet your stakeholders. Big organizations such as AP will have a number of governmental officials, trade associations, and the like that they have to maintain as part of the stakeholder universe. So once you have taken, let's say, 3 to 6 months to listen to everything that's being said, and again, asking what I call smart questions, such as, what is the one thing you feel has made us successful so far that we should maintain going forward? And asking the question the other way to say, what is the one thing we need to really change and get right if you want to succeed in the future? And so by doing that, you get a lot of data points, and aggregating those data points after that time period and coming back to the population to say, listen, I've taken 6 months to listen to everything you have to share. this is the compiled list of what I have heard. And this is why I now believe I would like to move in the direction that everyone feels we should be moving to. Now, what you have done here is building a coalition of alliances and generating a real level of buy-in and belief in the change, rather than, I think this is all rubbish and we need to change overnight and the board is behind me and let's go and kill everything we have done. And so this is just one angle of how you can get the culture piece wrong or attempt to get it right.
Got it. And so how do you differentiate, if that's some of the stuff that you'd look at within that culture piece, how is the sort of people, which I would think is inherently linked to culture, and the politics element of it, which again is inherently linked to the people of the culture, how do you distinguish those areas?
Mm-hmm. So with people, what I often mean by that in this distinction is appointments. So you have been named the new CEO, CFO, CHRO, what have you. And most C-level leaders take at least a year to then assess and say, okay, I've inherited a leadership team of 10, let's say. And I think this one or that individual, maybe one or two individuals, really are not what I need in this position. And so I might as well go about and bring about some, refresh, some upgrades here and there. Now, there is research, and one of the studies I cited is from Russell Reynolds, and they have done this multiple times over with venture capital firms and PE firms, where at the executive level only, let's say 3 to 4 months in, you really have a good hunch about the team that you have inherited. And so the suggestion here is, please do not wait another 8 or 9 months. If you have significant doubt that this one here and that one leadership team member over there have really what it takes to implement the strategy. And so if that's the case, the suggestion is to move fast and move decisively rather than waiting another 8 or 9 months. And all you're doing is adding incremental data points to what you already knew after 3 or 4 months. And this is what I call the executive hunch, right? And again, the suggestion is not to come in and kill everybody and replenish the whole leadership team unless there's a reason to do that, which is the company is going bankrupt or there has been a case of fraud or something where you need to immediately act. But other than that, what I mean with people is to get the people aspect right. And of course, as we said, all these 3 topics are interrelated, but the way I would distinguish culture from people is this aspect of appointments and kind of people leadership of things.
Really interesting. And that resonates a lot with my experience as a private equity investor, where it was, I suppose, almost a sort of truth to say, if you think it's time to remove an executive, it's already too late. You should have done it before. What should board members be doing in that context when they've got a CEO who's come in, you're helping them to transition? What's the role that you as a board member can play there, do you think, most helpfully?
So one of the jobs I did for 4 years was I was a nominating committee member. So I guess you could call it a non-com member. And I did that for the International Coaching Federation. And our job was simply to make sure that the best global board of director appointments are happening and the best candidates are put on a ballot for the members to vote on. And so one of the things we did was to make sure that the process is really robust and strong. And one of the things that can be done even with existing leadership teams is to suggest a management audit or a management diagnostic of some kind, and that is independently done. And I've done this exercise with companies such as Russell Reynolds, Spencer Stewart, and Korn Ferry, just to name 3 of those that have the capacity to do that on your behalf. And you can even upgrade that to be more than a technical kind of skills and future fitness type assessment, but also include cultural elements, leadership elements, and the like. And so again, by suggesting that exercise or making sure that, I just want to make sure that we got the right bench strength going forward. That would suggest that, there will be some screening exercise. And as a result of that, the weaker players need to either be upskilled or they will have to find other roles.
Got it. Okay. And in terms of the types of tests that you're looking at, are these sort of psychometrics? Are these things measuring raw horsepower or sort of intellect? Are these job-specific tests? Can you broadly categorize the sorts of things that you would expect to assess in something like this?
Yes, we actually did this on the back end of the Kabel Deutschland and Vodafone Germany merger. So I found myself in a situation as the head of HR, merging the two commercial business units into one, where we had a surplus talent situation. So we had 20 director level candidates and people on one side, another 20 here, but the to-be organization only had 20 positions. That meant essentially that 20 have no job in the future. Now, how do you go about suggesting who is the better fit from the two for the one position that only exists? And so I tried to approach this through what I call like normal business as usual. There's HR data, there's talent review data, there's succession planning. We do all these exercises and they all are data points we could use. And of course, the two managing directors of the business units had completely different views around my people are great and my people are great. And so we had to go external. In this particular case, I used Korn Ferry. And again, this is publicized information. And what they did is they did two different elements, combine and administer that on our behalf. So they took all 40 of these candidates through the exact same psychometric. It's a Korn Ferry tool that they have developed. It's a psychometric of their own. They've got their own IP. And they also applied two different lenses. One is what we call the Vodafone way. This is our leadership DNA. This is our cultural behaviors. This is what we expect to see from those leaders that are most successful. But what they also did is this future fitness aspect. And again, that included a 90-minute interview by two of the senior partners who do usually search mandates. And so what they did is they created this very lengthy report, first of all, existing from the competency assessment and how the candidate has self-assessed themselves against the competencies and what the engine is suggesting their competency level is really at. And if there's a big delta, what's driving that? But more importantly, what is the fits with the Vodafone culture and leadership and the future fitness for what the role requires maybe 2 or 5 years down the line. And so they never said hire or fire, but that was an additional data point that we took into consideration before making those appointments. And I think that was a really wise choice to go down that route, because what we did is to take away the bias from the MDs who were all very biased for their own organization, which is fantastic. But the reality is you only have 20 positions to fill and 40 candidates to look at. And so that was how we made it work in the end.
Really interesting. Okay, that brings us nicely on to the third part of your framework around politics. You've covered culture and people. Tell me more about politics and how a board member thinking about that CEO, particularly executive transition, should be thinking about helping them navigate through politics.
Yes. So first off, I have had the pleasure of working for 5 large corporations. And each one of those 5 has been a world's, like most admired company, top employer, what have you. And of course, if you were to speak to any of those leaders in those companies, they will say, politics in our company. Oh, we don't have that. It's our competitor's problem, or it's in this adjacent industry. It's really not in our house. No, we are all transparent and so on. So nobody really likes to admit that this thing called politics exists. And some people have found very creative words to describe it. There's a professor called Michael Watkins, famous author of The First 90 Days, and he doesn't use the word politics. He uses corporate diplomacy, as if it's like a profession you can learn and be trained. The skill you can get, I'm sure it's a skill at the end. So that's just the introduction to this wonderful topic. And of course, I myself, Ollie, I have fallen into this trap more than once, particularly when I move into the corporate head office. So when I was in a country operation, things were definitely less political. Maybe there was a bit of a politics at play between the entity at the country level, maybe the regional headquarters, and sometimes the global entity, if that was the next one up kind of business unit. But really, I mean, the politics just amplified significantly each time I moved into the corporate head office. And I think that the prominent example I share in my book, which again is public knowledge, when I joined this wonderful company called Roche in Basel, in Switzerland, I really learned my lesson there. Like I was running around with bruises and scars all over my face because I was tapping into one political incident after the other and after the other. And so it was really a lesson in how not to engage politically in an organization. And again, I really had to learn this the hard way. But the reality is some people are better at it and others aren't. And coming back to your question as to what could be a meaningful intervention, one of the things I do conduct on behalf of my executive transition clients is the so-called assimilation process. And the assimilation process is essentially connecting with their inherited leadership team members and really opening up towards their questions, curiosity, and so on, and do this in a live way and give answers to those. But the other part of that, which I call the immerse phase in my double diamond framework of executive transitions, is to really induct yourself around the politics and the culture of the organization. And again, when you are in your first 90 days or what have you, or even before that, you don't have to wait until day one to induct yourself about your new role. You can start, interviewing key stakeholders. I have a set of structured questions that I give to my clients. And so they go and interview those people on their own behalf. Sometimes I do it on their behalf. And there are questions in those structured set of questions, such as, what is the one thing that would derail the success of this role or myself? What is the one thing that is the unspoken truth about the way we go about the culture in this company? How are leadership traits described that people deem to be most successful in this company? So you try to unpack these elements that are generally never written up anywhere. I mean, you get job descriptions, you get strategy documents, you get all sorts of wonderful documents that are available to you. But what is the number one mistake that has led to other leaders departing the organization is generally not captured anywhere in writing. And so these are the kind of tools you can apply to de-risk your upcoming transition and making sure you don't fall into those traps and don't make those mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I can think about the sort of questions that I would ask, let's say, if I were trying to help a new CEO as a board member, thinking about the people, have you run the assessments on the people you've got there? And I think based on what you were saying around culture, have you thought about the time frame that you're going to look to impose, and have you spent enough time listening versus actioning change? I'm trying to think, what are the key questions that I could most helpfully ask as a non-executive to a CEO going in that would help them navigate this politics strand?
Yes. So first off, this is the last chapter of my book. So if anyone were to go on Google and type in, or ChatGPT for that matter, and type in how to be most effective during the first 90, 100 or 120 days, you get an X billion number of search results. Now, if you were to go on the same engine and type in how to be most effective or successful during my last 90, 100 or 120 days, you get less than 1% of the same search results, right? So this is essentially an unexplored territory. Now, the reason I mention this is because ideally, as a non-exec, as a board director, you shouldn't wait until the new gentleman or woman has joined, the lady has joined the company to start asking them these onboarding questions and so on. You ideally start to work with the incumbent and make sure that they utilize the last 90, 100 or 120 days to a degree that makes the incoming one's life a lot easier and a lot more smooth. So if you were to look at this process end to end, the beginning of it is the incumbent not transitioning out. And it only then moves to the new incumbent, a new appointee kind of moving in. And so this is something that is often unexplored and often also not researched well enough. I mean, the first 90 days has sold 1.5 million copies. It was written 20 years ago, so in 2003. Now, there are multiple books that all speak to the same thing. And my book is obviously very different because I only look at it through the executive lens. So if I wanted to write another book 10 years down the line, I would probably look at that topic and think that this is something that the world really needs. And it's kind of the completion of the full process. If it's a cycle, then you can have a full cycle if you work with the incumbent and the new kid on the block.
I love that. I can see the book title already, The Last 90 Days. It's going to be a big hit. I'm still wrestling with, as a board member, if I'm sitting there and I'm still with the incumbent CEO, what are the questions I should be asking at that point to help prepare for the new CEO coming in to navigate the politics? And then again, what are the questions or support guidance that I should be giving to that new CEO to navigate those politics?
Yes. So first off, I really don't want to bore the audience with a set of questions. But if I wanted to give away the theme of these questions, the theme of speaking to the current incumbent who is transitioning out, let's say 3 months down the line, if you had one more year in this role, what is the one thing that you would really act on as a key priority, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of, checking the sense of urgency. It may be a big ERP implementation. It may be a big appointment in the leadership team. It may be we haven't really done much in the ESG space or whatever that is, that really you want to make sure that that's being captured, right? So it's giving them some time frame to think of. And you could actually stretch it. You could say, if you had 3 more years in the role, how would you go about, give me a 2-minute idea about what would be the key items you would want to tackle. And so all you're doing is to really tap into their wisdom, the existing knowledge they have about the organization. And at the same time, making sure that you have what I call future trajectory and an idea around, okay, so if they were to stick around, then this is one more thing that they would want to do, or this is one other thing that they would have on their radar. And so I find that super important. You can make it more specific and say, which people-related discussions would I make if I could stay for 3 more years? You can ask yourself this question if you're the CEO or whoever the incumbent is, and think about how you think strategically about the leadership team. And maybe people have been great up until now, but 2 or 3 years down the line, you really need a significant upgrade here and there. You can be more specific around the operational momentum of the organization and say, do we have adequate operational excellence and momentum to deliver strong results this year and next year? Now, the incumbent may be thinking, hang on, I'm leaving 2 months down the line. But the fact to check back on their confidence level, to what degree is the engine oil to deliver, even if you're not here? And if something is missing, what is it? So we can make sure to kind of tie the loose ends with the new joiner and making sure that we take action there. So I just want to give you some ideas around how you can go about extrapolating at the time that is left from the existing incumbent and the new incumbent. And you could look at all these things. You could ask questions such as, what is your greatest single concern? And how would you go about solving it if you had another 3 years left? And so, what keeps you up at night? And so again, it's those kind of conversations that really help in this context, I find.
I want to pick up on a couple of things I've heard you talking about in the past, which really amazed me, which is this idea that 7 out of 10 CEOs don't have an induction process, and that most organizations fail to organize meetings with the key stakeholders, so investors, clients, suppliers. And this idea that 90% of effort is spent on selection and hiring versus supporting them once they're in the role. What do you think is the role the board should play? And I'm thinking mainly through the eyes of the non-executive independent directors here, to onboarding a new CEO.
Yes. So first off, again, this is all verified by independent studies. So when we circle back on the 70% of the CEOs, this was a study that was conducted by Genesis Advisors. And there were something like 486 or 68 CEOs that were surveyed. And I think this is a phenomenon I have observed in most of the companies I have worked for, actually, which is onboarding is done exceptionally well for 99.5% of the organization. So think of Michael Watkins's work, the first 90 days. At Vodafone, we had this wonderful thing called Perfect Day One. And so any new joiner, doesn't matter what level, typically excluded the top 250, right? So if you exclude the very top layer and the layer below, everyone else went through the exact same onboarding process. So first off, you get to pick your tech gear before you join. So as a new joiner, you will be sent your contract of employment and you have a link to pick your laptop and mobile phone device, right? Wonderful. So you don't have to be bothered by it on day one. You pre-order everything and everything is ready for you on day one when you join. All the admin arrangements, your badge, your SIM card is functioning and working. Your line manager has already sent you all the login details you need. The general business orientation is an entire day. And we did it face-to-face and then we reverted to virtual. We kept it at the virtual level after that. So there will be different functions coming and presenting the strategy, the group strategy team, the HR team, the finance team, the marketing team, and so on and so forth. And all the legal compliance stuff is taken care of. So as a critical industry, any new joiner must go through a screening and background checking. All that is done. Fabulous. Now, when we get to the top 50, this process obviously doesn't work. Or let me say, this process works equally well. It's just nowhere near sufficient to onboard the new CFO, right? And this is what I've observed in many organizations, which is they really optimize the onboarding process for the masses. And by doing that, they leave out the most valuable critical stakeholder group, which is the top 100 or top 250, of which the group CEO is one. And so this is real and this is true. And again, I've worked for some of the most wonderful companies, but when it really comes at the transition process at the very top, because it must be a manual process, there isn't any process in place. So that's just reality check. Now, in terms of what I believe are higher value activities, you can think of things like aligning expectations with teams and line managers. One of the things I do as part of my coaching practice is every time I have a C-suite client start to work with me, I conduct a 360 qualitative assessment on their behalf, which is anonymous in nature. And what I do is I share the aggregate results back with the incumbent. So I interview a set of their peers, a set of the direct reports and their line manager. And then I aggregate all the findings into one pager. Now, you will not believe, Ollie, sometimes even at the board level, when I interviewed 3 board of directors, how varied their expectations is of the same incumbent. Now, the chairman is very clear, or the chairwoman, what they want the incumbent to do or the new hire. But then you speak to this one and that one, and suddenly you hear very different things. And so again, the one thing, the intervention then for me is to go back to them and say, if I were you, I would have an independent conversation with the members of the board and really make sure you align on the expectations, because I'm hearing very different things there. That's one example. The second thing is that I consider to be a high value activity at the C-suite is organizing meaningful meetings with relevant stakeholders. Now, I have worked in organizations where the PA of the CEO is tasked with organizing all of that, right? And again, no offense, I think that's still better than not organizing anything. But really, what is the capacity of a PA to map the stakeholder universe, think of internal and external stakeholders, and then as a result, come up with an engagement plan and a communications plan for the new leader that's just joined in this role? So you need to have this ideally prepared by the HR department or someone who's in charge of the process to map the stakeholder universe and maintain and update it according to position. So if you got a CFO.
This is another example of a question for your last 90 days as well for the previous incumbent, who's probably
Absolutely.
the one person who's best placed to do that. So you need that on their checklist, and then have someone dedicated, whether it's the HR department or another senior exec, to be the continuity point.
And believe me, yes, it will be well worth the money, right? You need 1 FTE or half FTE or what have you, but that will be a significant boost to anyone's transition process as a result. And then last but not least is this idea about facilitating cultural familiarization. And I already gave 2 examples as to listening tour and the assimilation process, where you can really help the new leader to really understand what makes people successful in this company. What are the unspoken truths? What is typically an elephant in the room that nobody wants to point to, but it does exist and people are afraid of it. And so,
can you give me an example of what one of those might be?
Yeah. So I also work with leadership teams, and one of the recent clients of mine, we did this exercise with them. I administered the Hogan assessment, and I worked with the data scientists, and we aggregated the results at the team level. So we looked at not just the individual kind of makeup of those leaders, but we looked at the totality of it. And what came out was that this team is very warm, very comfortable with each other, very much heavy on building and maintaining relationships, but not necessarily providing constructive criticism to each other. Now, again, think of this as being a weight that is an overweight. Having an overweight on relationship and having not enough from the conflict and the constructive conflict part is a real issue, because everyone strongly agrees with everything that's being mentioned. And now the customer complaints are starting to go through the roof, but they have real difficulty in making sure that the team member and those that are supporting that team member are really taking decisive action. And so again, this is a real example of how an overweight of a particular trait and an underweight of something else can lead to an imbalance in that. And this is obviously not good for the business.
Super interesting. It reminds me of one of the 5 characteristics of a dysfunctional team, isn't it? Where they can't model healthy conflict.
I actually use that as the second intervention. So this is Dr. Patrick Lencioni's famous book, The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, that is also often also referred as to the five behaviors of effective teams. I think Wiley has purchased that tool and they have given it a positive spin, but nevertheless, it's the same thing. And as you say, there are things like trust, commitment, and conflict part of this 5-step pyramid.
Brilliant. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about non-executive transitions. Recently read CEO Excellence, which is a book written by a collection of McKinsey partners looking at the highest performing CEOs and highlights some of the common characteristics. And one of the ones it highlighted is that the highest performing CEOs typically have at least one independent director role, and normally not more than one because that becomes overwhelming. Not least because it provides them with a different perspective, but also a greater understanding of how to manage their own board. How should a board looking to encourage their own CEO to take on an independent role be thinking about managing that transition and maximizing the chances of it being successful? Is that something you've experienced?
Yes, I have. And again, in some organizations that I have had the pleasure of working with, this was not wanted at all. It was actually forbidden as part of the policy to say you're not to undertake any other employment, no matter what type of, even if it's the charity of your daughter's school or something, don't do that because they didn't want any distraction. And I find that quite frankly, a very old fashioned way of looking at things and trying to maximize the time that the CEO spent in the organization. And in other organizations, and I think Vodafone is one where I am able to cite it because it's public domain knowledge. We had both, not just the CEO, but also the CFO being an independent board of director for more than one organization. And so that was really seen as, if anything, it strengthens your position as an executive leader. I mean, arguably things are very different as a non-exec compared to an executive life. But really, if there's nothing coming out of this process as a benefit, the one sure benefit you will gain is how you will be treated with by the independent board of directors that is interacting with you. So at least you get to see it from the other side because you will be in charge in that construct. Now, there is a whole host of benefits that you can gain as a result, such as educating yourself about an entirely different business, seeing what the value chain is, that how they generate value for their clients and customers and the society, being challenged by maybe activist investors, an experience that hopefully no executive will ever have to go through. But should that come your way, you can at least claim that you have had experience in defending the company or doing things that are necessary in order to do that. So there is a wide range of benefits that come with that. Now, depending on what's the level of appetite of the CEO, I have a hard time imagining any CEO to say, no, I'm not interested, I'm good, talk to someone else. I have found it to be often that they are keen and they want, and then the company policy or the chairman or the chairwoman doesn't really want that. But if it's the case where there needs to be a bit of a convincing exercise going on, I think talking to the benefits and also pointing out to the fact that eventually there may be a non-exec lives down the line. And so a lot of CEOs and executives are thinking about, I want to do one or two more roles, and then I want to switch into what I call the portfolio life. And so that is the most wonderful way of not only giving value to the existing role and business that you have here, but also thinking about your long-term success and the way you start to think strategically and long-term about something that's also good for you and good for us. So it's a win-win-win in the end.
I mean, the time has flown by. It's time to go to the 5-question quickfire where I say a short statement and ask you for a quick response, if that's all right.
Sure.
So the best book every board member should read and why?
Oh, I won't be shouting it from the rooftops to buy my book, but I find any book that helps the incoming exec or board member to be more effective in what is the aim and ambition of the role is a helpful thing. So, of course, my book is out there, but there are many other books that are equally relevant. The one you mentioned, I really like as well. I've read it and I find that to be a very, very good and well-written book, also because it's a multiple author type book and they got many case studies also mentioned in the book. So there are plenty of books out there.
Your favorite quote and why?
Oh, my favorite quote is the one that I use at the very beginning of my book. It's from William Bridges and it says, we are at our best or most engaged when we are going through transitions. And so again, I think that the real statement is, it is when we are in transition that we are most completely alive. And so I find that to be a very telling statement. And it's proven that transitions are highly stressful, but they can also be highly exciting, a bit like a roller coaster, I guess.
Your best ever holiday and why?
Oh, I took the plunge with my family in the middle of the pandemic. We flew to Kenya to do one of these wildlife safari type tours. And we got really, really lucky because we were the only people on this camp that had capacity for 30 guests. And the three of us were the only people around, and they had the full staff for pandemic reasons kept within the camp. So you can imagine if you're being looked after by 30 people as a member of this wonderful destination, it's certainly a very expensive holiday, but one that we will cherish for the rest of our lives.
Great example of running against the herd, going on holiday during COVID and reaping the benefits. Your most significant professional insight?
Yes, I guess I have high ambition levels, and I'm not the most humble guy out there. I think it's fair to say. And if you ask my wife, she would definitely confirm that. The best insight I gained was actually through my non-com time. This was the real moment of insight for me, where I suddenly figured out that it's not about all the things that had made me successful inside organizations, but really sitting on the other side of this and really giving your skill and competency to a team to make sure that the best decisions are taken. So I never would have imagined it. When I signed up to do that, that was my way of paying it forward, because it was unpaid and it was a 4-year gig. But I can today say that that was one of the best decisions I took, because not only did I gain insights into life as a non-exec, but it also set me up for what I call my portfolio life, which is an active one right now. And I am actually in discussion with an organization to join the board. So it really was a wise investment and something that was really, really exciting for me personally as well.
Last but not least, your favorite podcast?
Oh, it's gotta be the neural one. I mean, I have a high respect for what you do, what your team does. I think you guys have found a niche that is rarely covered by other podcasts. If I were to name a leadership podcast, Ollie, there will be thousands, if not millions, that you could search for. But I find if anyone's interested in this non-exec space, this is probably the best place to go to. And the other one that I would like to point out is something that is not related to what you guys do. It's called Finding Mastery, and it's done by a guy called Dr. Michael Gervais. And he's a football coach or a psychologist that works with a football team in the US. And he had the most wonderful, from Satya Nadella to, the most amazing people that he invites. And he really unpacks the whole history of those people, their childhood, their early messages, what they consider to be mastery. And it's a super lengthy one. It's usually the episodes are an hour plus type. So it's not for the lighthearted, but really that is a wonderful podcast that I want to make it for.
Navid, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and insights from all your research. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And thank you so much, Ollie.